Hello and welcome to the FFRF's Ask an Atheist. I'm Liz Cavell, Deputy Legal Director at the Freedom from Religion Foundation. This week, we're looking back at all of the legal work we've been up to this past year to keep religion and government separate. We'll be highlighting some of our major complaints, our cases, and our victories. And joining me in studio is Chris Line, one of our attorneys. Hey, Chris. Hey. So as always, we want to hear your thoughts on the topics that we discussed today. Any questions or comments you have, leave them in the chat below or email them to askanatheist@ffrf.org. We'll try our best to answer your questions live during this show. So Chris, it's the end of the year. It's that time when we reflect back on what's happened this year, what we've achieved in the legal department, and what's coming up in the year ahead. So let's just start with kind of the biggest and the broadest, which is our lawsuits. We had a couple of lawsuits that have carried over from last year that we're still involved in, but this year we filed two really important new lawsuits. And what's different about them is that they're big, broad coalition lawsuits. So the first one I'm going to recap is that FFRF joined along with the ACLU of Louisiana, and Americans United for the Separation of Church and State. And as a coalition, we've sued challenging the newly enacted law in Louisiana that would require all public schools to display the Ten Commandments in every room of every public school. That was a really big, bold move by Louisiana, given that Ten Commandments displayed in public schools has been ruled unconstitutional by the Supreme Court as far back as the 80s. And so that was a really strong statement, I think, by the secular movement to join in coalition and file one big coalition lawsuit.
Yeah, I mean, as we'll get into a little bit when we start talking about some of the other stuff, particularly our complaints this year, we're going to see that like the Ten Commandments come up a lot.
Yeah.
We've got victories in it. We've got ongoing fights. And obviously this, at least for this upcoming year with this case and things going on, this is going to be the next big fight, this big question of, can you put the Ten Commandments in schools? Now, the answer for the longest time has been very clear that you cannot.
No.
Crystal clear. I mean, a lot of things with our area of law, the Establishment Clause, are kind of, we're relying on similar cases.
Right.
And like trying to extrapolate. This one, it's not a similar case. It is directly on point.
Right.
The Ten Commandments in public schools have been struck down, and thus, if they're allowed, it will be only because the law is being reversed.
Right.
And
by the current Supreme Court, which has not happened yet.
Yep.
But as with so many things this past year, we've seen a major emboldening of government actors, the people with power, Christians in power who really want to sort of abuse that office to put their own religious beliefs kind of all over the public office, or in this case, the public schools. So we see the state of Louisiana doing what it's doing now because it's no coincidence. It's because they believe that the current Supreme Court will back them and eventually overturn the longstanding precedent that you can't display the Ten Commandments like devotionally for all time in public schools. It's an abuse of the public school system, and it's coercive.
Yeah.
Yeah. So just one more thing on that case, which is where it stands. We actually already won a preliminary injunction in that case, which means the judge blocked the law from taking effect while the case is being litigated, because the judge understands that in all likelihood, Louisiana's action violates the law.
Yeah, I mean, so as you know, with that lawsuit, we're in a broad coalition of groups, but even within FFRF, we have a broad coalition of staff members who are working on these sort of cases for us. We've got lawyers, legal staff, and people working, and I think we have a picture. Yeah, you can see our
Look at our smiling
staff.
faces. Yes, we do. We are a small but mighty team of lawyers and legal assistants working on coordinating all of our litigation in-house, and as we'll talk about later, all of our non-litigation efforts, which are vast.
Yeah. To answer the question that nobody was asking, the reason why I'm not in that photo is that I have sort of shifted my role here at FFRF. I'm still an attorney, but kind of shifting away from sort of the main litigation, main legal team. That's why I wasn't in the photo of our attorneys. I am still an attorney here. Don't worry about it.
Longtime staff attorney and is now moving to our rapid response counsel position. Also, Chris is our official, unofficial photographer, so is always the person behind the camera taking the photos.
Yeah.
So
that's also
the more
why.
you know. One more lawsuit I wanted to talk about because it was filed this year and also was a big one was, speaking of emboldened actors, the only Ryan Walters, the superintendent of public instruction for the state of Oklahoma, just kind of one day waved his magic wand and mandated that all public schools in Oklahoma need to incorporate the Bible into all of their public school curricula. Also announced that he was going to use taxpayer dollars to buy all the Bibles that would be needed to fulfill this mandate. And so again, a large coalition, FFRF, along with AU, the ACLU of Oklahoma, and a local Oklahoma nonprofit, Oklahoma Appleseed Center, all sued to block Ryan Walters' mandate and to also ask the court to stop the state from spending millions of Oklahomans' taxpayer dollars on Bibles to support this unconstitutional mandate. This case, this is actually really significant, represents 32 plaintiffs. Usually we're lucky if we can find one or two plaintiffs in a public school lawsuit to come forward. In this case, we have 14 public school parents, 4 public school teachers, 3 Oklahoma faith leaders, and they're all joining as plaintiffs to sue to stop this action by Ryan Walters in the state of Oklahoma.
Yeah, and I think this case, as well as that previous case that we're involved in, is probably going to be representing the status quo going forward. Just because, as we've kind of noted, like our backs are kind of against the wall with the Supreme Court. We know that they don't believe in the Establishment Clause. We know that they want to take it down. We're definitely going to have to be working with these other groups a lot in these cases. And in particular in this situation, obviously we're non-religious and representing sort of the non-religious view. We are having to partner a lot more with faith people, as with the plaintiffs in this lawsuit, because, obviously the separation of church and state is for all of us. It protects atheists, Christians, everyone. And so I think going forward, as we try to, uphold what's left and protect the separation of church and state, we're going to be working with other groups like this and a variety of people, not just the non-religious, as we try to, keep church and state separate going forward in the legal arena.
Right. Our lawsuits are going to be not all, but oftentimes broad coalition efforts to hold the line of state-church separation that does still exist, right? Like we said, the Supreme Court has not given permission to these actors to do what they're doing. They're sort of taking liberties and trying to push the Supreme Court that's already shown hostility to the Establishment Clause, trying to push them even farther and farther into the radical direction. And so we're here to hold the line, and we'll do that still with our lawsuits going forward after this year. We closed a few lawsuits last year. I think we had 5 or 6 lawsuits that we closed favorably. But one other thing in our litigation department that I did want to talk about from 2024 that's been a change from past years is the growth of our amicus brief practice. So we filed 12 amicus briefs this year, which is up significantly from past years. And Chris, please tell our eyes glazing over audience what an amicus brief is.
Yeah, so amicus brief, that's a friend of the court brief. So basically it's us coming in. We're not the actual plaintiffs or defendants in the case, but we've got the legal knowledge to understand the issues that are going on in the case. So we come in and we let the court know important facts or important law involving what's going on in the case and kind of, come in with an expertise view to try to help the court make the right decision in these cases.
Right.
So it's an opportunity for us to weigh in, even though we're not actually the plaintiffs in a case. We can come in and say, here's why, you need to rule this way, and to point out things that the plaintiffs themselves may not be necessarily discussing or arguing in their case.
And as the federal courts especially have been pushed farther and farther to the right and become more ideological and hostile to the separation of church and state, amicus briefs are an opportunity for us to kind of reach into some of these cases that we might not necessarily take ourselves. So this year we filed amicus briefs in the EMTALA cases involving right or the obligation of hospitals receiving public funding to provide stabilizing abortion care, as is the law of the land under EMTALA, a statute. We've filed amicus briefs in cases that involve public schools being sued by teachers who don't want to use students' correct names or pronouns. So we're filing amicus briefs in cases that wouldn't necessarily be cases our organization would bring, but is an opportunity for us to add context to these cases that is oftentimes missing in the realm of how they impact or involve religious rights, how bodily autonomy connects to religious purposes of legislators, the religious and conscience-based rights of litigants and plaintiffs, and also to point out so much of the hypocrisy and the bad judgment that we see in the courts now. So it's a place where we can do a lot of arguing within lawsuits that are really important to the movement, and we can say a lot more than we usually can in our own cases.
Yeah, and I don't know how effective they are in terms of changing minds at, like, say, the Supreme Court level, but at other levels, there are still reasonable judges out there, regardless of whether they're more liberal or more conservative, who are willing to hear out reason and understanding, and that are persuadable, through arguments and just sort of pointing out things. Oh, maybe they didn't realize this. I think particularly in the religious realm, you're looking at things like, they may have a gut instinct to rule like, we want to rule for Christians as much as possible, but to allow them to see, here's where there could be problems if we do that, to sort of highlight for them, like, okay, well, if you want to allow the Christians to take over all of our public spaces, like, you may end up having the Satanic Temple coming in and also, having the right to put up religious messages that you don't agree with, things like that, where we can kind of try to help persuade them, push them in the right direction so that, we get better rulings.
Yeah. And providing that context not only for the courts, but for the court of public opinion, and how these cases are being covered and talked about and understood by the people whose lives are being affected by the decisions made in federal courts.
Right.
So,
yep. And so despite sort of the way, the potential downfalls, the things we've got to look out for in the courts, we are still winning on our complaints. We're making changes at the local level. School districts, cities, things are still doing the right thing as of now. So this is going to be hard to kind of explain, but basically as of October 24th, we had 185 non-litigation victories and 687 letters sent. So that was between, I think, October 2023 and October 2024.
That's right. And again, this is talking about our non-litigation letters and victories. That means that these are actions we're taking outside of the courtroom and just trying to resolve issues that come to us cooperatively with usually public school districts that we are corresponding with on behalf of a complainant that comes to us with a problem in their school district or in their local community. This is non-litigation work. We, as you saw in the last graphic, do an awful lot of this. Almost 700 letters were sent from convention to convention. Yeah. So that's in the last year for us as of late October. So the bulk of our work that we're doing on behalf of complainants is in this sort of non-litigation space. And we get a lot of things done efficiently through this type of action.
Yeah. So just rattle through some of the things
so
we've
just
done.
some highlights from the past year.
So speaking of Ryan Walters, who we had to sue, who is awful in Oklahoma, we're dealing with him a lot. But back in February, he went to a local Riverside elementary school where he led students in prayer. He recorded that prayer and posted it on his social media pages.
Of course he did.
Prompting us to write to the superintendent of the school saying, hey, just so you know, in the future, you can't have the Oklahoma superintendent of public schools come and talk to your students anymore because he's going to try to proselytize and pray with them. The school district essentially agreed with us, said, yep, as you noted, we were not aware that he was going to do this, and we won't allow this to happen again in the future. You also see a lot of our complaints come out of Oklahoma for obvious reasons. Another one of which, speaking of which, in March, we got the Putnam City Schools in Oklahoma to remove a Bible verse display from its middle school. That display said, "Now all glory to God, who is able through his mighty power at work within us to accomplish infinitely more than we might ask or imagine."
It's subtle.
Yeah, and I'm not sure
That's
what
on
that
the
has
wall
to
of
do
a public middle school.
Yeah, and until this was brought to our attention and we wrote to the superintendent and said, take it down, apparently it was just going to stay there.
Yeah.
It doesn't seem to have any connection. I mean, not that any of the other religious things they try to put up has a connection to schools, but I'm not sure why that was even up in the first place. But luckily, because someone brought it to our attention, we wrote a letter. We were able to get that taken down, even in Ryan Walters, Oklahoma. In May, FFRF wrote a letter to Park Rapids area schools in Minnesota to encourage the district not to approve a proposal from a former board member, Dennis Dodge, to erect a Ten Commandments monument on school property. The proposal included the biblical edicts on one side and a quote from Dodge on the other side, reading, "We must put God back into our educational system before we lose our children and this great nation."
Someone have a God complex?
Yeah. After we sent our letter, the board voted on June 3rd to deny the proposal and did not put up this guy's weird, I mean, not even just the Ten Commandments, but clearly like his own version.
And also a quote from me.
Yeah, his own version
Love
of
that.
the Ten Commandments.
For our school kids.
Yeah, as we know, a lot of these are related to the Ten Commandments. So because of FFRF, inmates and others at Minnesota's Itasca County Jail will not have religion forced upon them in the form of a massive 2-story Ten Commandments display. FFRF and some local activists challenged this display back in May, and the prison decided to paint over it, and that is now, there were some other quotes there too, but this was
significant because, well, obviously you saw the scale of that thing towering over inmates, right? The environment doesn't get much more coercive than a jail, a county jail. You're literally there in captivity and can't choose to come into contact with that or not. And the size of it being absolutely imposing. But what was great is that that was brought to our attention before the jail opened to inmates, and therefore it was painted over and, taken out of the plant before anyone ever had to move in there.
Yeah, that was big. Obviously, they had to expend a lot of money to put these up and then take them down. If only someone there had just had the sense to question it before, we had to come in.
I know. Seems silly.
Yeah, in May, in Raleigh County Schools, West Virginia, a concerned Bradley Elementary School parent informed us that a teacher at the school was abusing his position to proselytize and impose his personal religious beliefs onto students. The teacher reportedly began his classes with Bible stories and ended them by leading students in prayer. This school-sponsored religious activity had apparently been occurring since at least 2019.
Wow.
So that's how long it took for one of these parents to come forward and let us know that this was going on. Unsurprisingly, as soon as we went to the school with this extremely illegal behavior stopped, and our complainant confirmed the teachers no longer reading Bible stories or praying with students. They expressed their gratitude to us for helping them end this violation. So I wonder how many people out there didn't know that we exist, or that they should do something, that they could do something about this.
Or what's worse, don't know that a public school teacher is indoctrinating their kids into his religion.
Right, because a lot of times we only hear about this after, like, oh, my child told me that this happened today, and I asked them about it, and they said, oh, of course, we pray every day, things like that. But obviously that's a situation, so this guy's praying for like 4 or 5 years, where the school should have caught it itself. This is not something we should have to come in.
Right.
Obviously, in West Virginia, unfortunately, it is something that we have to come in and do. But these are the type of situations we can still have a big effect on, because despite how bad the court's gotten and the cases going up to it, we're not at the point where the court's ready to say, oh yeah, let's just let teachers proselytize to students in the classroom all day.
Every day for 5 years.
Yeah. So another issue this year, people may be aware there was an election. Some people saw it. I'm just remembering now because this was brought up. But basically, as we do in a lot of election years, we had to write many, many letters to various churches and religious organizations we don't write it to them, about many churches.
To
and
the
religion-
IRS.
Yes, to the IRS about churches and religious organizations interfering in the presidential election. We wrote a lot, but in particular, I just wanted to point out that in July, we lodged a formal complaint with the IRS after the Catholic League engaged in unlawful political campaigning in a post called "Kamala Harris is not religious friendly." In that post, they basically detailed why you should not vote for Kamala Harris, which of course is illegal for a nonprofit organization to do.
Right, which churches are.
Yep. We've covered this in multiple Ask an Atheist episodes, but basically, as a 501c3, like FFRF is, we cannot endorse a candidate. So we can't tell you who to vote for, who to vote against. We're not allowed to interfere in that process.
I say this every time we talk about this, but it's the only thing nonprofits can't do is endorse or oppose candidates for office. It's really not that onerous.
Yeah.
And there's so many things that nonprofits can do, even even close to an election, like issue advocacy, talk about the issues that are at stake and the policies that will be affected by an election. So it's a small concession for the immense privilege of tax exemption, but the Catholic League just can't abide.
Yep, and like I said, so did a lot of other churches. And we had read about churches on both sides of the aisle. There were churches who campaigned for Trump. There were churches who campaigned for Kamala Harris, both of which equally unconstitutional and equally deserving of losing their tax-exempt status, because that's just what you do as a nonprofit. You aren't allowed to get involved in politics using tax-free money, which is what you get because that's the privilege you have as a nonprofit organization.
Right, because we don't want our tax dollars to go into political campaigning.
Correct.
Candidate campaigning, because that makes nonprofits PACs.
Yep. At the end of August, FFRF asked for the removal of an unconstitutional 10 Commandments display at the Jefferson County Courthouse in Illinois. The display is nearly 6.5 feet tall and sits in the center of the first floor lobby. The display includes a Protestant version of the 10 Commandments, given its particular language and numbering. And at the bottom of the display is the biblical quote, Proverbs 21:15, which reads, "When justice is done, it is a joy to the righteous, but terror to the evildoers."
Yikes. Yeah, so I'm sensing a trend out there. It seems like this whole 10 Commandments thing is really, really catching in 2024.
Yeah, it seems like, I think we all have kind of gathered by this point what the 10 Commandments are, and for most of them it seems to be just a way to mark your territory. That seems to be what's happening. We're going to put it up in classrooms so that we can mark them as Christian territory. We're going to put them up in our county government. We're going to try to put the 10 Commandments, our jails. Let's put the 10 Commandments up everywhere. It's a sign for us to say, hey, we're Team Christian, and that's unfortunately what we're seeing, and working to get rid of that, because it's just very clearly a religious message that is being imposed. It's literally a set of religious rules. It's the doctrine of a religion being posted on the walls of our public areas, and we need to keep fighting to get them out of there.
Well, the county courthouse that you just mentioned in Illinois is a recent one that was recently brought to our attention, and we are still in the process of battling to get that taken down.
Yes. So this is kind of an interesting one, because there's a lot of complex things with it, but this also is not just, this is not involving Christianity for once, which is rare for us to have complaints that aren't
this
just directly tied to that. This is a strange one. So in October, we wrote to Milwaukee, Wisconsin. We're based here in Wisconsin, about an eruvin around the city. For people who aren't aware of what that is, basically, Jewish people are not, or Orthodox Jewish people, I should be more specific, are not allowed to do certain things on the Sabbath. They're not allowed to push stroller, very simple things. They just can't do. They can't go out and get groceries. There's a lot of things they can't do on the Sabbath. That's their own self-imposed religious rule. But what they discovered was that if they put up a piece of wire around large swaths of cities, they can then claim that all of that land is their backyard, basically, and then they are allowed to do things on the Sabbath. So what they've done in many cities, Milwaukee included, is that there's just basically a piece of string that runs all along, it's metal usually, just up on telephone wires and all across and around. And if that string breaks, then they are not allowed to do anything because its sort of magic power has like worn off. It has to be intact all the time. Well, the reason why we wrote about it this year in Milwaukee is that a bike rider riding his bike down a road actually got the eruv had fallen, was coming across, and he caught it on his neck. And it kind of wrapped a little bit around his neck.
Clotheslined this guy on his bike because it was sagging, and it's nobody's job to maintain it, even though it's on public property, because of course it's a private religious, I don't know, symbol or...
Yeah, it's a weird mix of like symbol and physical. It's just so yeah, this guy, very lucky that he was not severely injured because he said it had wrapped a couple times around his neck. He was going about 25 miles an hour.
Just wild.
Estimates. Which, you know, one of the things we said in our letter is that, like, this was an unnecessary thing before. Like, assuming nobody gets hurt by it, it's kind of silly to allow this group to just put a piece of wire up all around the city for their magical, purposes. But now that it has shown to also potentially injure people, especially, the city should take it down. There's no reason for the city to facilitate one religious group's workaround for their own religious rules, which is all this is. The entire purpose for it is that they have these rules they're supposed to follow based on their own religion. This is they are choosing to follow these rules, right. And then now have to have the city help them
create a physical fiction so that they can comply with their own religious rules.
Yeah, which is
it's bizarre.
It's just
because again, the reason it's problematic is because it requires the use of public property all around the city. These, not everywhere, but in a lot of places, these wires need to hang from public property, public telephone poles, across public sidewalks and rights of way. And so they are, potentially hazardous. They need to be maintained. They could cause harm to people and create liability for whoever owns the property that they go across. And so it's just a massive mess that public or that cities and counties shouldn't allow.
Yeah, and so this doesn't bother me because I don't really have any sort of magical beliefs, but I do think you can also see how someone who does sort of have their own religious beliefs might not like the idea of being told that they're a part of this Jewish like that they're included in this. So because these things will be around entire neighborhoods and large swaths of cities. So someone living there, like I said, it wouldn't bother me if you told me, oh, you're
part of
you're in this
my Jewish home.
But it might to someone else who has a strong religious belief that's different than that, might not like the religious implications of being brought into the
problematic for many reasons.
Yeah. Speaking back of the Ten Commandments, we appealed to the Iredell Statesville School Board to abandon a compulsory district-wide Ten Commandments display proposal in October.
Again, another school board voting on a Ten Commandments display.
Right. So on October 14th, the Iredell Statesville School Board voted against the display proposal, echoing the reasoning we had sent when we complained about it and even referenced us. Board member Doug Knight said that he had received emails from a national organization about challenging the legality of displaying the founding documents poster at issue there in district schools. Yeah. So directly related to us fighting back against this Ten Commandments display, the school board voted against it, rightly, as we noted, because it is unconstitutional to be putting up Ten Commandments in
and
public
just
schools.
Wild how many school boards are considering it now.
Yeah, there's just these certain pockets and places where we're seeing most of the issues, which comes up now because just last week we were once again standing up for religious liberty in Parkersburg, West Virginia. In Parkersburg, basically a pagan organization was discriminatorily barred from participating in the city's Christmas parade on December 7th. That group, the Appalachian Pagan Ministry, that's a nonprofit organization dedicated to serving pagan and earth-centered spiritual communities. Through prison outreach, public education, and community building efforts, the ministry works to create a more inclusive and understanding world for all faiths. So this group, this small group in Parkersburg, West Virginia, they heard that there was this Christmas parade going on. They wanted to participate. They got all the stuff they needed for a float. They filed the application, but then they were told that they are not going to be allowed to participate. It's kind of gets confusing if you get into the legal weeds, but basically the city's now claiming that it does not sponsor the parade.
It's a private event.
It's a private event, but when they were rejected, they were directly told that the mayor was consulted and was the one making the decision not to include them. So for those, you may be familiar with Parkersburg, that was where we won a lawsuit against the city in 2022, ending the recitation of the Lord's Prayer at every city council meeting. Specifically, the ministry reports it was told the problem was its pagan identity and because its website states it works with Satanists. So this was religious discrimination, but obviously, like I said, the question is going to be whether this is really city-sponsored or not. So at the very least, the city's going to have to stop any sponsorship and promotion of this parade if it's not a city parade. If it is a city parade, which it certainly seems to be if the mayor is saying who can and cannot be in it, then the city's got way bigger issues on their hands because they have violated the religious rights of this
not to mention the free speech rights. The court is so excited to protect that doubly protected of religiously motivated speech. So we'll see what the facts support.
We've got records coming from them, so we'll be able to see a little bit more about the communications that the city's involved in there and see whether they're really running it or not, and hopefully we can do something to help this group out. Last thing, our agenda, another 10 Commandments, obviously, because that's what you'd want to finish on. So last week we called on the Kern County School Board in Bakersfield, California, to reject a proposal to display the 10 Commandments in every school classroom. At last night's meeting, which I reviewed earlier this morning, dozens of people turned out to tell the board not to push a religious agenda on students, including many Christians. A lot of the people that were standing against the 10 Commandments were citing the Bible while doing so, citing their Christian faith.
You love to see it.
Unfortunately, it's not clear based on, so they didn't actually end up taking a vote at this. This was an informational meeting where they were having this idea presented to them. They may take a vote at a future meeting. FFRF's lobbying arm, FFRF Action Fund, actually got an action alert out to people to try to get them to come out to this meeting. Other groups also helped promote this meeting, and about 30 people ended up talking, the majority of which were against the 10 Commandments. And so we're going to keep following and pursuing this, and definitely going to try to get people out again if they are going to hold a vote and talk on that, because we can avoid. I mean, they should want to avoid the expense of a lawsuit or something on a situation like this. They shouldn't want to stick their necks out like this, particularly when these things are clearly being litigated. We're involved in a 10 Commandments lawsuit. I mean, these things are going through the courts. Like, it's clearly a litigious or a litigation-heavy issue.
In case these elected officials care, their own community is asking them to reject this proposal. So let's see.
Hopefully we can, we'll have good results there to report on next year's legal review.
Exactly. Well, that's a little flavor for our non-litigation complaints, many of which have resulted in victories for state church separation over the past year. And now we're going to answer some audience questions and just kind of see where that conversation goes. This is a good one, and I think that we should address it as we close out 2024, which is, will FFRF have to change its approach to state church violations under a new administration more hostile to secular advocacy?
I mean, broadly, probably, but in terms of the day-to-day, the complaints and things like that, not really. I mean, we're reaching out to superintendents, local city officials, and trying to, convince them of what they need to do. We can obviously still, as we noted, take legal action in a lot of cases, particularly on the most serious and clear issues. So a lot of that is not going to change under the administration because that, sort of the executive branch doesn't have a lot of push on these areas necessarily.
Right. So I would just say a few things. One is that the courts have been, this is not the first unfriendly to secularism administration that we faced in our years as an organization, and that a lot of the growing hostility in the courts has been happening for a lot of years now. So we've been adapting our strategies to that reality for a long time. A lot of our efforts might be focused on executive actions that will be taken to undermine the separation of church and state, and that might be something that's different. And of course, ours and other organizations in the movement have all been contingency planning for this possibility, which was always known. And so we will sort of be strategizing how to advance our mission under some changing circumstances over the next few years. So, all right, here's one. Is there an issue area that FFRF tends to focus on the most?
Yeah, I mean, I think that came up, obviously the Ten Commandments, but more specifically, a lot of that tied up in schools. Yeah. That's really, I think, where we're most focused at this time is our public schools, because that does seem to be the place that still has the most, left, the most legal protection left, the most clear-cut law, and, is going to be a tough area, I think, for them to really chip away at as they have in other areas. Like I think that's still a stronghold for us in terms of separating church and state is our public schools and, ensuring, students aren't being indoctrinated into religion in the public schools. Yeah.
And, FFRF has long and always prioritized violations in the public schools, and it's always been the bulk of the violations that are reported to us are arising in the public schools. And the courts have usually agreed with us that public schools deserve the most broad and robust protection that the Establishment Clause has to offer. And that's because, obviously, public school children are both the most captive audience that's like under the thumb of the government, and they're a more vulnerable and impressionable audience when it comes to religious coercion by the government. And so that kind of continues to be our priority and is certainly an area of law where we consider ourselves a bulwark against any erosion of the law that exists to protect public school students. Okay, let's get a couple of more here. Have there been instances where FFRF wanted to act on a violation but wasn't able to? And what prevents this? It's a good question.
Yeah, so it's complicated from my perspective because, the way things kind of work here, just for anyone who doesn't know, is our complaints come in, we've got an intake team that directly gets it, and those attorneys and legal assistant will filter out a lot of the ones that we can't take action on. So me as an attorney, I'm mostly seeing things that we can take action on when you're working with that. But yeah, we're definitely do have to, for various reasons. I mean, in particular, I think one thing that comes up a lot is where it turns out that it's actually not a separation of church and state issue, but a more personal religious issue. We obviously don't handle personal legal issues that just because they tie with religion. We're really focused on just things going on in terms of the separation of church and state and public entities. But yeah, there's also situations where, we do still try to get involved, but we acknowledge that it is not so much a legal issue anymore and that we're going to just basically be doing it to try to get the right thing done without necessarily being able to take a lawsuit. So one big thing that comes to mind with that a lot is prayer at public meetings. Unfortunately, the law is really bad on that. They basically said, yeah, you can have prayer to open like a city council meeting. School boards is still not allowed, but city council meetings, those sort of things, can have prayer, assuming that it's not being used just to advance one particular religion.
Or denigrate another.
Or denigrate another, right. So that's a situation where it comes up, but we're still kind of working on that in certain situations, particularly when a city council just adopts it. Like they haven't been doing prayer, and now they're going to start. Well, we'll write to them, even though there's probably not legal grounds for it. We write to them, with sort of a policy argument, noting, hey, you probably have non-Christians there. You shouldn't, you've been not having prayer this whole time, and it seems like your city has existed. So I don't think you need to bring prayer in now and things like that. So we can kind of try to persuade them not to do certain things that aren't technically legal violations anymore, unfortunately, because of our changing courts, but where we can hopefully still persuade people to do the right thing. And we have. There have been situations where, despite the fact that legally they don't have to stop doing prayer, we write to them and they say, you know what, like this actually, we're going to do a moment of silence instead, because they're right. Like we shouldn't be imposing religion on all these people. We're going to say a moment of silence so that everyone can pray to whatever their beliefs are, and we're not imposing one belief onto people and things like that.
So what you're saying is kind of capturing something I'm thinking of, which will be our final thought in a minute, but it's answering sort of a common thread that is in all these questions here on my iPad. Like, is there a way to ensure these violations don't recur? How is FFRF keeping up with all these violations? How can FFRF be poised to take on violators better in the new year? How can FFRF handle bad actors? How is FFRF dealing with an unfavorable Supreme Court, and how is that changing your work? And I think what you're speaking to kind of answers all of these questions, which is, what do we do if we care about state-church separation, but we have, a hostile administration, we have a hostile federal judiciary, and of course we have very oftentimes hostile elected officials, both locally and nationally. And it's exhausting and it's demoralizing when we see gains undone or we can't make the gains that we want to. But I do think that we have a lot of practice and a lot of experience sort of, as Chris is describing, pulling all these other levers of power that exist, because we still have a democracy and the people still have power. So the 30 people that went to that school board meeting and spoke up against this school board, proposal to adopt a Ten Commandments display in their schools, that may or may not make a difference to the final vote, but I bet it had an impact. It will impact how things go forward, whether that ends up being something that ends in a lawsuit or whether somehow there's intervention that gets the school board on a correct course. Same thing with, and again, like those are oftentimes action alerts from organizations that are cluing people in to the fact that this is happening in their community. So by joining organizations like ours, you can sort of get on our alerts, get on other organizations' alerts, and you can learn about what's happening in your community. You don't have to keep track of all that because there are groups like ours that are doing that. And you can bring your power to bear where you still have some power, and that may not be at the Supreme Court, but there are other levers that we can always pull to influence government actors, if not force them by law to do the right thing and the thing that protects the religious liberty of the most citizens and constituents.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say in my time, I've written thousands of letters now, and you would be surprised sometimes at what ends up being effective and where you end up making change. There's so many times where I'll write a letter and I'll be like, there's just no way this small city in Mississippi, Alabama is going to listen and do the right thing. And then they do. Mm-hmm. Not all the time, a lot of times not. Yeah. But, you don't know unless you try. You can't, I don't know exactly how we, we're not always going to win. But if you don't try, then you will always lose, I guess. You can't, you won't get anywhere if you're not trying. So that's obviously an important thing, is that we keep working at this, because we never know what's going to make the difference. So you got to try and do everything you can to, fix these issues. And we're going to keep at that going into the next year too. Great. This is a great place to wrap this week's episode. All right. That wraps up this week's episode of FFRF's Ask an Atheist. Don't miss our weekly radio show, Free Thought Radio. This week, it's a winter solstice celebration. We'll play some satirical Christmas songs and tell jokes for the holidays. You can find Free Thought Radio at ffrf.org/radio or wherever you get your podcasts.
And be sure to check out the latest episode of We Dissent, the only podcast hosted exclusively by women constitutional lawyers discussing state-church separation. Listen and subscribe to We Dissent wherever you get your podcasts, or check us out online at we-dissent.org.
We also have a lot of fun and irreverent merch available on our online store, which make a great holiday gift for your secular friends and family. There's t-shirts, bumpers, stickers, pins, coffee mugs, books, and so much more. You can check all that out by visiting ffrf.org/shop.
Finally, if you want more information about the Freedom from Religion Foundation, check out our website at ffrf.org. If you're a member already, thank you. If not, please join us. And we will see you next time on FFRF's Ask an Atheist.